Imagine staring down at your own body, feeling the delicate, miraculous flutter of a new life kicking inside you, only to look up and see another woman's eyes locked onto your stomach with an intensity that makes your blood run completely cold. What do you do when the person laying claim to your unborn child isn't some random stranger on the street, but someone who has a permanent place in your family? I never thought I would find myself in a position where my own pregnancy felt like it was being hijacked, but as I sit here today, heavily pregnant and exhausted, I am genuinely terrified of the woman who claims to love me the most. It wasn't always this suffocating. When my husband and I first found out we were expecting, it was the happiest day of our lives. We had dreamed of starting a family, of filling our quiet home with the sounds of a baby, and when that positive test finally appeared, we held each other and cried tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Of course, we couldn't wait to share the news. My husband is an only child, and his mother has always been incredibly devoted to him. She's a widow, and since her husband passed away years ago, my husband has been the absolute center of her universe. So, naturally, we knew this baby would mean the world to her. When we told her, her reaction was everything you would want from a future grandmother. She wept, she hugged us tightly, and she celebrated with us. For the first few weeks, it was beautiful. I felt surrounded by love and support, but then something shifted. It didn't happen overnight, but rather like a slow, creeping tide that suddenly leaves you realizing you're drowning. It started with subtle changes in her vocabulary. It was right around the 12-week mark when the morning sickness was kicking my butt, and I was barely keeping crackers down. She came over to drop off some soup, which was incredibly sweet of her, but as she walked through the front door, she didn't ask me how I was feeling. She looked past my eyes, stared directly at my abdomen, and asked, "How is my baby doing?" At first, I brushed it off. I smiled politely and said the baby was fine, just making me a little nauseous. I told myself it was just a figure of speech. Grandparents say things like that, right? They're excited. But it didn't stop there. The phrase, "my baby," became her absolute default. When wherever she called, it wasn't to check on her daughter-in-law. It was to ask, "Is my baby letting you sleep?" Or, "Are you taking good care of my baby?" Every conversation became entirely centered on this possessive phrasing. One evening, my husband and I were at her house for dinner. We were getting ready to leave, and she walked us to the door. She reached out, patted my husband on the arm, then pointed directly at my stomach and said, "Take care of both of my babies." I remember freezing in the doorway, a forced, tight smile plastered on my face. My husband just chuckled, completely oblivious to the sudden knot twisting in my chest. To him, it was just his mum being her usual loving, doting self. But to me, it felt like an erasure. I wasn't a person in that moment. I was a vessel. Then, the physical boundaries started to dissolve entirely. It's one thing to deal with annoying comments, but it's an entirely different beast when someone starts invading your physical space without a second thought. I was barely 16 weeks pregnant. I didn't even have a visible baby bump yet. Just that awkward phase where your clothes fit a little tighter and you constantly feel bloated. We were sitting on her living room couch, just casually chatting about the upcoming holidays, when she suddenly leaned over. She didn't ask. She didn't even give a warning. She just reached out, placed both her hands firmly on my lower stomach, and began to forcefully rub it. I physically stiffened, my back pressing hard against the sofa cushions, my breath catching in my throat. Before I could even process what was happening or find the words to politely ask her to back up, she took it a step further. She leaned all the way down and pressed her actual face against my stomach, my completely flat stomach. She started talking directly into my belly button in this high-pitched baby voice, whispering secrets to a fetus that was barely the size of an avocado and couldn't even hear yet. I sat there in stunned silence, my heart racing, feeling utterly paralyzed by the sheer awkwardness and inappropriate nature of the moment. I looked over at my husband, my eyes silently screaming for help, but he was just looking at his phone, completely missing the silent crisis unfolding right next to him. I felt so exposed, so incredibly uncomfortable in my own skin. It wasn't a shared moment of familial joy. It felt like a bizarre, territorial marking. When we finally got in the car to go home, I burst into tears. I told my husband how profoundly uncomfortable it made me feel. I explained that I felt like my bodily autonomy was being completely stripped away, that I felt less like his wife and more like an incubator functioning solely to deliver her future grandchild. To his credit, my husband listened. He held my hand and promised he would talk to her. He understood that my body was mine, and that uninvited touching, pregnant or not, was crossing a line. He called her the next day and gently set a boundary, explaining that the unannounced stomach rubbing and face pressing was making me uncomfortable, and asking her to please give me some personal space. She agreed to stop, and technically she did. But the very first time I saw her after that boundary was set, she made sure I knew exactly how she felt about it. She walked into the room, didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was doing, but instead stared at my growing midsection, let out a loud, dramatic sigh, and practically whined. "Ugh, I want to touch it so bad." It was a masterclass in passive aggression. She was obeying the letter of the law, but completely mocking the spirit of it. It made me feel like I was the bad guy, the cruel daughter-in-law keeping a loving grandmother away from her prize. And the hardest part about all of this? I know deep down in my heart that she isn't a malicious person. She isn't sitting in a dark room plotting my demise or trying to hurt me on purpose. She genuinely, truly believes she is just being a caring, involved mother-in-law, but her good intentions are paving a road straight to my mental breakdown. Because when someone doesn't mean any harm, it makes setting firm boundaries feel like an act of cruelty. I was already drowning in the anxiety of being a first-time mum, and her overwhelming presence was making it 10 times worse. I thought the uncomfortable touching and the possessive comments were the peak of the problem. I thought if we could just get through the pregnancy, things would settle down. I had absolutely no idea that her true boundary-stomping masterpiece was yet to come, and that it would revolve entirely around the most vulnerable, terrifying moment of my life, the delivery room. The thing about being 36 weeks pregnant is that your threshold for nonsense disappears. You are physically exhausted, your feet are swollen, your back aches, and your patience is basically a non-renewable resource that you've already spent. I was trying to focus on nesting, on getting the nursery ready, and on mentally preparing myself for the marathon of labor. But instead of focusing on my own health, my brain was stuck in a constant loop of, how do I deal with her? Then came the day she dropped the bomb. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a, how do you feel about this? Or, would you mind if... It was a declaration of policy. We were having lunch and she looked at me with this bright, expectant smile, the kind that makes you feel like you're about to receive a wonderful gift, right before the trap snaps shut. She leaned forward, clasped her hands together and said, "I've been looking into the hospital protocols, and I've decided I want to be there when you give birth. So, make sure you let me know the second you start having contractions." I stared at her, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. She continued, completely unfazed. "And don't worry, I've already cleared my schedule for that week. I'm going to stay at your house for a few days afterward to help you adjust and take care of the baby." The air left the room. My husband was sitting right there and he didn't say a word. He just smiled, probably thinking, "Oh, how nice, she wants to help." But my stomach dropped. This wasn't help. This was an invasion. I don't want anyone in that delivery room except for my husband. Not my mum, not my best friend, and certainly not my mother-in-law. Labour is the most raw, vulnerable, and private experience a woman can go through. It's about the transformation into motherhood, the intimacy between partners, and the very first moments of a new life. I couldn't imagine being in the throes of that, exposed, in pain, doing the hardest work of my life, and having to worry about my mother-in-law's reaction or her watching me struggle. The idea of her standing in the corner, waiting for the baby to arrive, felt like a nightmare. And then there was the staying for a few days to help part. I know she thinks that's a perk. She thinks she's doing me a favour by doing laundry or holding the baby. But I know what it would really look like. It would look like her hovering over my shoulder, criticising how I change a diaper, taking the baby away from me the second I need to shower or rest, and making my home feel like a hotel where I have to host a guest while recovering from major medical trauma. I looked at my husband, silently begging him to intervene, but he was lost in her enthusiasm. He's a good man, he really is, but he has been conditioned his entire life to view his mother's presence as a comfort. To him, there is no such thing as too much of his mother. He doesn't see the boundary stomping. He sees a doting grandmother. He doesn't see the incubator comments. He sees a woman who is just so excited she can't contain her love. When we finally got home, I couldn't hold it back anymore. I sat him down and I told him, as calmly as I could, that I was not okay with this. I told him that the delivery room is going to be for us, and only us. I told him that after the baby is born, we are going to need time, just the three of us, to bond, to heal, and to figure out how to be parents without an audience. He listened, and he did agree with me, to an extent. But then he hit me with the line I was dreading. But she's really just trying to help. She doesn't mean any harm, you know. She just loves us. If I say no to her, it's going to hurt her feelings so much. Can't we just let her come in for a little while? That's when the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. It isn't just her, it's the dynamic. She creates this environment where saying no makes you the villain. Because she frames everything as love and support, rejecting it makes you look ungrateful and cold. It's a trap. If I say, no, you can't come, I'm the woman keeping a grandmother from her grandchild. If I say, no, you can't touch me, I'm the woman who is being sensitive or difficult. I feel like I'm being gaslit by kindness. I'm being smothered by people who genuinely think they're being helpful. And now, I'm 36 weeks pregnant, terrified of the confrontation that is coming, and even more terrified of what happens if I don't confront it. Because if she thinks she can dictate my birth and my immediate postpartum period without asking, what is going to happen when the baby is actually here? Will she come over unannounced to help? Will she take the baby out of my arms whenever she feels like it? Will she become a permanent fixture in our house, assuming that her place is everywhere she wants to be? I'm sitting here, watching my stomach move, feeling this little life inside me, and all I can think about is the fight I have to wage. I have to be the bad guy. I have to be the one who says no to the woman who means no harm. It feels like the loneliest position in the world. The tension in our home was becoming palpable. It was no longer just a mother-in-law problem. It was a marriage problem. My husband, bless his heart, was stuck in the middle of a tug of war he didn't even realize was happening. Every time I tried to explain that I needed space, he would soften, his shoulders dropping in that way that signaled he was about to defend her. He'd say things like, "Babe, I hear you, but she's just lonely. She lost her husband. She's excited about the future, and she's trying to be part of the village. Why are you making this a war?" Hearing that broke my heart because it made me feel like I was the only one who saw the reality of the situation. I wasn't fighting a war. I was fighting for the sanctity of my own motherhood. I was fighting for the right to hold my baby without feeling like I was renting them out. I looked at him, my eyes welling up with tears. and I asked him a question that I hoped would finally make the light bulb go off. If your mother is so desperate to be part of the village, why is she trying to be the one running the village? Why is my comfort, my recovery, and my boundary setting constantly sacrificed at the altar of her good intentions? He didn't have an answer for that. He just looked away, guilt etched into his face. He knew I was right, but acknowledging that meant he had to confront the woman he had spent his entire life trying to please. It's a heavy burden to ask a grown man to set firm, unwavering boundaries with the mother who raised him, especially when she has used that nurturing mask to bypass his own autonomy for decades. As the weeks ticked down to my due date, the dread started to overshadow the excitement of meeting my baby. I found myself checking my phone with anxiety every time it buzzed, terrified it would be another text from her about getting the room ready or making sure the hospital bag has X, Y, and Z for her. It wasn't just about the delivery room anymore. It was about the control. She was inserting herself into every single aspect of my journey. She had even started buying furniture for our house. Things I hadn't asked for, things that didn't match our style, and things that she would inevitably expect to see in the nursery. When I tried to return one of the items, a gaudy, oversized rocking chair that took up half the room, she cried. She told my husband that she had found it at an estate sale, that it reminded her of his childhood, and that she just wanted her grandbaby to be comfortable. And just like that, I became the villain again. I was the ungrateful daughter-in-law, throwing out a sentimental gift. I had to apologize. I had to keep the chair. Every time I looked at it, I felt a spark of anger. It wasn't just a chair. It was a symbol of her footprint in my house. I realized then that if I didn't take a stand now, before the baby arrived, I would lose the opportunity entirely. When the baby comes, the stakes get higher. You're sleep-deprived, you're healing, you're hormonal. You don't have the mental capacity to engage in a battle of wills with someone who doesn't believe in boundaries. I knew I had to be firm, not just for my own sanity, but for the sake of our marriage. If she continued to push and I continued to bend, I was going to end up resenting my husband, and he was going to end up resenting me for keeping his mother away. So, I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I decided to stop waiting for my husband to be the shield and started being my own. I set up a time for the three of us to talk. Not a casual lunch, not a quick catch-up over coffee, but a sit-down. I knew she would play the victim. I knew she would turn on the waterworks. I knew she would say, "I'm just so excited. I didn't mean to upset you." And I had to be prepared for it. I walked into that meeting feeling like I was walking onto a battlefield. My hands were shaking, and I felt the baby kick. A sharp, sudden reminder that I was doing this for more than just myself. I had to protect this little life from being treated like a prop. I started the conversation with kindness, acknowledging her excitement. "I know you're incredibly excited to be a grandmother," I began, my voice steady despite the racing of my heart. "And I am so glad that this baby is going to be so loved. But the way that excitement is being expressed is causing me a lot of stress. When I hear that my body is your incubator, or that you're going to be in the delivery room, or that you're going to move into help without us ever discussing it, I feel overwhelmed. I don't feel supported. I feel controlled." Her face went pale. The hurt, or perhaps the shock, was written all over it. She looked at my husband, clearly expecting him to step in and save her from my words. But he didn't. He sat there, hands clasped, silent. She took a long, shaky breath and then started with the classic. "I just don't understand. I'm family. Why are you treating me like an intruder? I've raised a son. I know what it's like. I'm just trying to make sure you have the help you need because I know how hard it is." I didn't let her deflect. I didn't let her make it about my perceived rudeness. I brought it back to the core issue. "It isn't about you being an intruder," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "It's about this being our transition into parenthood. We need to learn how to do this as a couple. We need to be the ones to make the mistakes and the ones to figure out the solutions. And when it comes to the birth, that is a private medical event. You won't be there. That is not up for debate." The silence that followed was deafening. It felt like the air in the room was being sucked out. She looked as though I had slapped her. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to apologize. I didn't feel the need to soften the blow. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, a weight lifting off my shoulders that I hadn't realized I was carrying. The silence in that room was heavy, suffocatingly so. My mother-in-law stared at me, her eyes glassing over with that familiar, stinging sheen of tears that usually signaled the beginning of her emotional campaign. She didn't respond immediately. She just let the silence stretch, hoping, perhaps, that my husband would swoop in and offer a compromise that would have inevitably meant me backing down. But my husband didn't jump. He looked at his mother, then at me, and for the first time in this entire pregnancy, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He realized that this wasn't about me being mean or cold. He saw that I was fighting for the sanctity of the family he and I were building. He finally saw that his mother's love had become a cage, and that I was the only one brave enough to try to open the door. She eventually let out a sharp, ragged breath and looked down at her lap, picking at the fabric of her skirt. I just don't want to be left out," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've been a part of your lives for so long, and I just feel like you're pushing me away because you don't value my experience." That was the turning point. It was the moment I realized she wasn't just being pushy. She was afraid. She was afraid of losing her relevance in her son's life, and she was using the baby as a bridge to make sure she stayed central. It made me sad for her, honestly. It's a tragic thing to base your entire identity on being needed by others. But empathy, as I'd learned, does not mean I have to sacrifice my boundaries. I reached across the small coffee table and placed my hand, the one that had been rubbed and patted and claimed against my will, on hers. "We aren't pushing you away," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "We are inviting you to be a grandmother. That's a beautiful role. But being a grandmother is not the same as being a parent. You have had your time to raise your children, to make those decisions, to be the center of that world. Now it is our turn. We need you to trust us to do it our way, even if our way is different from yours." She didn't agree right then. She didn't suddenly smile and thank me for the lesson. She stayed quiet for a long time, the tension slowly bleeding out of the room. It wasn't the Hallmark movie ending where everyone hugs and everything is suddenly perfect. It was a cold, hard, reality-based boundary. It was messy, it was awkward, and it was deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. When she finally left that evening, she didn't offer a dramatic goodbye. She just hugged my husband, gave me a polite, strained smile, and walked out the door. The moment the lock clicked into place behind her, I sank onto the floor and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for months. My husband came over and sat on the floor next to me. He didn't say anything at first. He just wrapped his arm around my shoulders and held me tight. "I'm sorry," he whispered into my hair. I didn't realize how much she was suffering. I was so used to her way of doing things that I just thought it was normal. "You're right. We need to do this our way." That was the breakthrough I had been praying for. It didn't mean that the road ahead would be easy. I knew that in the coming weeks, especially once the baby actually arrived, there would be more tests. She would likely show up unannounced. She would likely make passive-aggressive comments about how we were doing things wrong. She would likely try to sneak in a few more "my baby" comments when she thought I wasn't listening. But the difference now was that we were on the same team. We had a plan. We knew that when she pushed, we would push back. Together. As I sit here now, closer than ever to my due date, the anxiety is still there, but it's different. It's no longer the paralyzing fear of being a victim in my own life. It's the protective, fierce instinct of a mother. I am not an incubator. I am not a supporting character in her life. I am a mother. And while I will always respect the fact that she loves her son, I have learned that true love, for a child, for a spouse, and for a family, requires the space to grow. It requires boundaries that aren't just lines in the sand, but walls built to protect the intimacy of a new family. I've learned that the people who get angry when you set boundaries are the ones who benefited most from you having none. And that is a lesson I will carry with me into every single chapter of this motherhood journey. I'm no longer worried about being the jerk. I'm only worried about being the best mother I can be to this little one who is already teaching me how to stand up for myself. The days following that conversation felt like a surreal calm after a relentless, howling storm. The house, usually a site of anxiety and stifled breaths, felt different. It was quieter, perhaps, but the air was lighter. My husband began to step up in ways I hadn't even dared to ask for. He started fielding her texts with a new, firm brevity. When she would send a message asking, "Is my baby moving today? I need to see a video of your tummy right now," he would simply reply, "She's resting and we are too. We'll let you know when we have news." No apologies, no excuses, no begging for understanding. Just a boundary, laid out clearly, and left to stand on its own. It was during these quiet days that I really began to process the sheer weight of what I had survived. It's easy, looking back, to wonder why I didn't just yell at her on day one. But when you are in the thick of it, especially when you are pregnant and hormonal, the social contract feels so heavy. You want to be the good daughter-in-law. You want to honor your husband's family. You're conditioned to believe that if you make someone else unhappy, you have fundamentally failed. But what I realized during those long, restless nights of third trimester insomnia was that the cost of being good was the complete loss of my own identity. I started spending time in the nursery, not as a place where she had dictated the furniture or the color scheme, but as a space for me. I rearranged the items she had bought. I cleared away the clutter that felt like her invasion. I made that space mine. Every time I touched the crib or organized the tiny, delicate clothes, I felt a surge of autonomy. This was my labor. This was my transition. I was preparing to bring a life into the world, and I was finally, truly, the one at the helm. But of course, life and mother-in-laws rarely give up their territory without a few more skirmishes. A week later, she showed up at our front door. No call, no text. She had a bag of groceries in one hand and a giant, hideous, neon-coloured mobile in the other. I looked through the peephole and felt that familiar, cold spike of panic. My husband was in the shower, and I was standing there in my sweatpants, feeling absolutely 0% like a host. I opened the door, and there she was, beaming. "I just knew you'd be craving strawberries, so I brought some. And look, I found this for the baby. It's just so bright and stimulating. It'll be perfect for over the crib." I didn't invite her in. I stood in the doorway, my hand on the frame, blocking the entrance. "That's very thoughtful, but we actually aren't having guests today," I said, my voice steady, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "We're having a really quiet day, and I'm just not up for visitors." She looked at me, her smile faltering, her eyes darting past me into the house. "Oh, it's just me. I won't stay long, I promise. I just wanted to drop these off." "I appreciate the groceries, really," I said, taking the bag from her. "But I'm not opening the door for anyone right now. We're working on protecting our rest before the baby arrives. We'll see you soon, though." I didn't give her a chance to argue. I didn't give her a chance to oops her way inside. I closed the door. The sound of that latch clicking was the loudest, sweetest sound I had ever heard. I stood there, leaning against the wood, waiting for her to knock again, to yell, to do something. But she didn't. She walked away. When my husband came out of the shower and I told him what happened, he didn't get mad at me. He didn't tell me to apologize. He actually walked over, kissed my forehead and said, "Thank you for holding the line. I know that wasn't easy." That was the moment I knew. The incubator phase was over. We weren't just a couple anymore. We were a unit, a fortress. We were building a wall around our life, and it felt like the most powerful thing I had ever done. But I also started thinking about all the other women who might be going through exactly what I went through. The ones who are afraid to speak up because they're terrified of being called difficult. The ones who are being swallowed whole by someone else's expectations of love. If there is one thing I've learned, it's that your boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of preservation. If someone gets hurt because you asked for the space you need to exist, that is not your fault. That is their inability to respect the person you actually are, rather than the person they want you to be. I want to ask those of you listening, have you ever had to draw a line in the sand with family, even when it felt like the hardest thing you'd ever do? What happened when you finally stood your ground? Did it change the dynamic, or did it make things worse? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I think the more we talk about these boundaries, the more we realize we aren't alone in this, the easier it becomes to protect our own peace. And if you've enjoyed hearing about this part of my journey, consider subscribing to the channel. We're going to be talking about a lot more of these unspoken family dynamics, and I'd love for you to join our community. As I stand here now, just days away from my due date, I don't feel afraid anymore. I feel ready. I'm ready to meet my baby, and I'm ready to be the mother I know I can be. Unfiltered, unmanaged, and completely, authentically me. The final stretch of pregnancy is a strange, suspended reality. You're waiting for a biological clock to strike midnight, while simultaneously trying to keep your own world from spinning off its axis. For me, that meant the constant nagging question of, what happens when the baby is actually here? Because let's be honest, boundaries are easy to enforce when you're standing at your own front door. They're much harder to uphold when you're recovering from birth, sleep-deprived, and holding a newborn that everyone else in the world seems to think is their personal property. I had started crafting a postpartum plan. It wasn't a document I handed out, but a set of non-negotiable rules my husband and I had agreed upon. No visitors for the first 2 weeks, no exceptions, no helping by taking the baby away while I was trying to figure out breastfeeding. And most importantly, no one, under any circumstances, was allowed to just drop by. A few days before my due date, my mother-in-law invited us over for a last supper before the baby arrived. I was hesitant. Part of me wanted to stay in my sanctuary, where I knew exactly how every interaction would play out. But I also knew that if I wanted to set the tone for our new family dynamic, I couldn't just disappear. I had to face the music, and I had to do it with a calm, unwavering presence. When we arrived, the house smelled of roast chicken and that familiar, cloying scent of her perfume. She greeted us at the door with a hug that felt a little too tight, a little too desperate. But the house was different. She had taken down a lot of the baby-related decor she'd put up earlier. It was a subtle acknowledgement, I think, that her previous takeover had been noticed. She didn't try to touch my stomach immediately, though her eyes kept drifting down there, almost like she was struggling to resist the pull. Dinner was polite. It was civil, but the tension was still there, buzzing like a low-frequency hum in the background. She kept talking about her own labour experiences, the horror stories that every mother-in-law seems to love sharing to make you feel anxious. She talked about how she knew what was best for the baby's sleep schedule and how she couldn't wait to be the one to give the first bottle. I looked over at my husband. He didn't flinch. He didn't laugh it off. He simply said, "Mum, we've already discussed how we're handling sleep and feeding. We've got a system, and we're going to be the ones handling those first few days." She stiffened. "I'm just trying to help, dear. I know you think you have a system, but babies don't care about your system. They care about being held. and I'm going to be right there to hold them whenever you get tired. It was a classic boundary stomp, disguised as helpfulness. She was essentially saying, I don't care what your rules are. I'm going to do what I want. I took a deep breath, feeling the baby kick against my ribs. I realized that this conversation would never truly end. It was going to be a recurring theme for the rest of my life. The question wasn't how to make her stop. The question was how to stop letting it affect me. I realized that my power didn't come from getting her to agree with me. My power came from my ability to say no and not feel guilty about it. We aren't going to be having guests for the first 2 weeks, I said, my voice quiet but firm. I need that time to heal and to bond with the baby. I love you and I want you to be a part of this baby's life. But those first 2 weeks are for us, not for visitors, not for help, just us. She opened her mouth, likely to argue, to play the I'm a grandma card, to use the but I'm family line. But before she could get the words out, I continued. This isn't a suggestion, and it isn't an invitation for negotiation. It's the plan. I'm letting you know now, so there are no surprises when you show up and the door is locked. My husband put his hand on my back, a solid, grounding presence. She's right, Mom. We've talked about it, and that's what we're doing. We need you to respect that if you want us to have a healthy relationship once the baby is here. She stared at us for a long, uncomfortable moment. The mask of the dearly devoted grandmother slipped for a second, and I saw a flash of something else. Anger? Fear? Resentment? But then she pulled it back together. She let out a sigh, the kind that was meant to make me feel small. Fine, she said, her voice tight. If that's what you want, I just don't see why you have to be so difficult. I felt a pang of sadness. I truly wanted her to be a part of our lives. I wanted a grandmother for my child who was supportive and respectful. But I realized that I couldn't force her to be that person. I could only control my own actions and the environment I created for my child. If being difficult meant protecting my peace, then I was going to be the most difficult person she had ever met. Driving home that night, I felt a strange sense of liberation. I had done it. I had set the boundary. I had defended it, and I hadn't crumbled when she tried to push back. I was ready. I felt like a different person than the one who had written that first post, trembling with anxiety over someone else's opinion of my pregnancy. I know that the delivery is going to be intense. I know the postpartum period will have its own set of challenges. But I also know that I have the tools now. I have my husband. I have my voice. And I have the clarity that comes from knowing that my first job is not to be a good daughter-in-law. My first job is to be a mother. And that in itself is a full-time, sacred duty that leaves no room for anything else. The final countdown to my due date felt less like a ticking clock and more like a steady, rhythmic drumbeat, a signal that the time for preparation was officially over and the time for action had begun. I found myself in a state of strange, focused calm. Every item in the nursery was in its place, every diaper was organised, and my hospital bag sat by the door, a small, tangible manifestation of the boundaries I'd fought so hard to establish. My husband and I spent the last few days in a quiet, cocoon-like bubble. We didn't talk much about her. We didn't talk about the what-ifs, or the potential for her to show up unannounced. We focused entirely on each other, on the life we were about to begin, and on the strength we had discovered in our partnership. It was a beautiful, tender time, the kind of intimacy that only exists right before everything you know changes forever. Then, the night came. The contractions started as a dull, persistent ache in my lower back, something I'd been warned about but hadn't truly understood until it was happening. It was 3 a.m. The house was dark, silent, and entirely our own. I looked at my husband, who was already awake, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. We didn't need to say a word. We knew the hours that followed were a blur of intense, primal focus. There was no room in my brain for external thoughts, no room for worry about anyone else's feelings, and definitely no room for my mother-in-law. I was entirely present in the labour, in the agony, and in the overwhelming, staggering beauty of the process. My husband was there, acting as the perfect shield, managing the environment, handling the logistics, and letting me be exactly who I needed to be. A woman in the middle of a miracle. We hadn't told anyone we were in labour. Not yet. We knew the moment we did, the phones would start lighting up. The messages would pour in. Any news? Is the baby here yet? Call me the second you have news. We wanted these first few hours, the actual arrival, to be ours, and ours alone. We were going to give ourselves the gift of the golden hour, that sacred window of skin-to-skin contact where the world outside the hospital room ceases to exist. When our child finally arrived, the world tilted on its axis. The crying, the warmth, the overwhelming rush of hormones. It was everything they say it is, and a million things they can't describe. I looked down at my baby, and every ounce of anxiety I'd felt over the last 9 months simply evaporated. She was my baby. Not our baby in the sense of a communal project, but my baby. The one I had carried, protected, and fought for. I looked at my husband, who was weeping openly. His face lit with a kind of joy I'd never seen before. We held each other, and in that moment, the power struggle with his mother felt like a lifetime ago. It didn't matter anymore. We had won. We had protected this space, and we had done it together. But as the adrenaline began to fade, reality started to seep back into the edges of my consciousness. I remembered the text message I had pre-written. I knew that if I didn't send it, she would eventually find out through other channels, and that would only create a more volatile situation. I picked up my phone, my fingers still shaking with exhaustion. "We are officially parents," the text read. "Everyone is healthy and doing well. We are going to be taking some time to rest and bond over the next few days, so we won't be having visitors. We'll let you know when we're ready for company. Thank you for respecting our space." I sent it, and I turned my phone off. I didn't check for a response. I didn't care. I laid back against the pillows, feeling the incredible weight of the baby against my chest. And I finally let go. I had done it. I had set the boundary, I had defended the territory, and I had successfully navigated the most difficult transition of my life without losing myself. If there is one thing I want anyone listening to this story to take away, it is this. You are the gatekeeper of your own life. You are the only person who can decide who gets access to your most vulnerable moments. If someone tries to convince you that your boundaries are mean or selfish, remember that they are only saying that because they want the rules to favour them. Don't fall for the guilt. Don't apologise for your existence or your need for privacy. The relationship with your family is supposed to be a source of strength, not a source of constant underlying dread. If it's become the latter, you have every right to pull back, to close the door, and to redefine the terms of engagement. It's not easy, and it won't always be pretty, but the peace you find on the other side, that is worth every single uncomfortable conversation. I want to thank all of you for listening to my story. You've been a part of my journey, and knowing that there's a community out there who understands the importance of these boundaries has made the last few months so much easier to bear. Please, let me know in the comments, what's the one boundary you've set that you're most proud of? And if you're currently in the middle of a struggle, what's the one thing you need to hear to help you hold the line? If this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to subscribe and join us for more. We're just getting started on this adventure, and there's so much more to talk about. As for me, I'm going to put the phone down, lean into this new, beautiful life, and cherish the fact that for the first time in a long time, everything is exactly where it's supposed to be.